So welcome to this new venture from my YouTube channel. This is the first in a series of conversations with people whose work I enjoy and whose work I'd like to share with my viewers. So today I'm in conversation with William A. Young. He's an Edinburgh-based author who recently wrote a book called The Ghosts of the Forest, which we're going to be discussing. And William Young has spent many years researching Celtic history and legend and exploring the wild places associated with them, especially those of the Old North. So welcome, William. Thanks for taking the time out to record this conversation with me.
Hello there. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So I'd like to start off by asking you how you got interested in this work of connecting legend to landscape.
For me, I grew up in Scotland, so we were surrounded from an early age by an awful lot of the physical remains of Celtic cultures all over the hills and all over the landscape. When I was in my 20s, which is reasonably long ago time now, I found myself living in the city of Edinburgh with very little in the way of money at the time. And so I and some friends of mine, we started to pay visits down to the Borders region in southern Scotland, because it was much, much cheaper to get onto a bus and go camping down there than it was to head up into the Highlands. And the thing about the Borders, the hill country there, is that almost throughout Tweeddale, throughout the region around, almost every single major hilltop that you see is ringed by the remains of old Celtic fortifications. So just naturally, by going out and having camping trips, you were confronted by the most extraordinary reminders of the presence of a Celtic civilization, and ended up exploring them, sleeping in them, learning about them. It's also a region where there's a huge amount of literary history. The border ballads have been recorded from the time of Scott onwards. There are older versions, there's plenty of them even than that. And so the region has a history in terms of the legends that have been recorded that's really second to none. And what I ended up doing was eventually realizing that there was the potential to dig into this and try and put some of the connections back together, to try and take some of the stories that had survived and to look for the roots of them in the Celtic mythology and the deeper history that existed. Part of the reason that seemed necessary to do was that a lot of folklore and a lot of the legendary material that remains, it's not always seen as being possible to find a really deep component to the heritage of that, because it was recorded relatively late, 18th, 19th century, so there's a lot of room for evolution to occur. I had the feeling, having spent a fair number of years with the material, that actually this is maybe a little bit of a mistake, that maybe there is more of a complete inheritance that was preserved within it. And so I tried to look for evidence of that kind of connection, to see if that hypothesis might prove correct. And The Ghosts of the Forest, the book I've ended up producing, is the eventual culmination of that process.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Walter Scott, because I think, like a lot of people, I have a bit of a Scottish cringe about him. And the beginning of your book, the first chapter or two, you talk a lot about Scott. And I like the way you presented him quite realistically for what he was, but appreciating the good stuff that he did as far as a collector.
Scott, he has a huge place within Scottish literature. I don't read a lot of his historical fiction. I find it has dated quite a bit, but because of the huge place he had at the time, enormously popular in Victorian literature, he really did shape the way that Scotland formed. And because of the place the border ballads held in his own life, in shaping how he saw the country, and in shaping the kind of stories that he came up with, he's a really intriguing window into that past. But I do agree with you, there is a little bit of a lot of his kind of tartan stuff seems a bit twee now. I prefer the older stuff that inspired him to some of the stuff that he himself came up with.
Yeah, me too. So your book really touched a chord with me, as I think you've probably guessed by now. And
I'm glad to hear that.
It's quite a multifaceted thing, your book, taking us walking with you in the landscape and then diving pretty deep into literature and folklore. What made you decide to produce such a mammoth project?
Maybe a slightly contradictory answer to that question, but almost by making it bigger, it was a way to make it more accessible. If you were to write something that was simply a textbook, something that described in the briefest, clearest, most factual way the details of connections between legends and Scottish culture, it would become something fairly swiftly that's accessible only to a specialist audience, and quite a small one. What I tried to do instead was to take people on their journey with me, to look at how I ended up being interested in these subjects, what it was that made them become fascinating for me, and then to guide people along in that process as well. So to meet the landscapes, to fall in love with the places, to get a flavour of the setting in which all of this takes place, to tell the stories themselves, to make sure to relate them in a fashion that is readable, accessible, easy to understand, and then only then really to introduce the technical science stuff. Because otherwise, it seemed to me that it really is for geeks like me and yourself. And it's not necessarily something that's going to engage the wider populace, people who are coming into the area to learn a bit more about it, or people who have an interest but don't have that level of specialist knowledge. And an awful lot of the academic stuff that's out there, which is a really, really good standard, it's quite intimidating for people who are new to the field. People who don't fully understand can get put off by the level of technical jargon that there is there. So I tried to find a way to guide people along with me and pass on the process by which I built up my enthusiasm to them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's no point in scaring people off that things just seem too, ivory tower, and they can't access, it can't belong to them. The knowledge can't belong to them. And I think I liked the way you reproduced or retold every relevant story to what you were trying to put across in full. So it's all there in the book. Everything they need is in that book, and that's a really stroke of genius, I think.
I did feel a little bit guilty about having to update the language of some of them, because some of the old Scots tales, the rhythm and the sound of the language itself is really, really beautiful in the original form. And some of the Welsh language in some of the stories, likewise, the form, the names, the way the language is written is really beautiful. But I did update it. And I tried to stay as close to the original text as is reasonably practically possible, but also at the same time, where there are words or phrases that just are not going to be accessible to the non-specialist reader, to make sure that they were converted into clear English as faithfully as possible to the original text. But again, so that you can just simply pick it up and read it from end to end without having to consult a glossary or consult a textbook to understand what you're dealing with. And I do think that that is important. I would encourage anyone who enjoys those stories and likes my versions to go and have a look at the originals themselves as well, because they are utterly gorgeous, and absolutely learn to read Welsh.
I thought you did a really nice job on the Scots, just to modernize it just enough and anglicize it just enough that people could get the meaning. You hit a good happy medium there. Not that you need my approval.
No, thank you very much. I mean, it's the aim ultimately, like your objectives presumably with this YouTube channel, it's about taking things that we think are wonderful, but looking for a way to open them up to a wider audience. And that's quite a different process from a lot of the specialist academic work that's going on out there. And I think it is important that there should be both. I absolutely love a whole lot of the academic stuff that's coming out at the moment. There's some really fascinating things being produced in recent years. I do think that there's a place alongside of that, informed to the maximum possible extent by what the specialists are doing, but also vocally and technically distinct, so as to present information in a way that aims for a broad community.
So speaking of visual things, I know you've brought a few photographs along, so would you share some of those with us and just give the viewers some idea of what you get up to?
Because I go and explore everywhere that I can get to, I end up with a lot of photographs. And this is the cover of my book, just to get a little plug in nice and early on. The image in the background here of the mist, this is actually a location that is quite famous from the history of Scotland, which I was not able to slot into the book. These are the woods behind Carter Haugh, where the Ballad of Tam Lin is set, and a little wander up the hills there. So that's one that I do heartily recommend to anybody who's not engaged much with the Scottish border ballad tradition. That particular tale is a great starting point if you should choose not to use my book as a gateway. I will read on. This is, unfortunately, myself. I don't have an awful lot of selfies, but I felt that I should do something illustrative of the adventures we undertake. So my brother was kind enough to take this shot while we were off on a journey through the Trossachs. And this is what basically consists of my research method for an awful lot of what I actually come up with. Popping the rucksack onto the back, several days worth of supplies into that, and roam off into somewhere a bit insane. This particular location is a high pass at a place called the Shean Nacara, which runs in between the Braes of Balquidder and the top of Loch Lomond. The mound in the background is a Shean, that's a Gaelic word for an elf mound, which is an old gateway to the other world, effectively, where the souls of the dead were meant to reside before the Christian religion placed them into the kirkyard. And we had a little journey in this one tracing the life trajectory of Reverend Robert Kirk, who was the author of The Secret Commonwealth. That's a text that crops up periodically as a source of information within my book, but which I would dearly love to examine in greater detail at a future date. This is a shot from the Eildons. This is actually taken in the course of one of the journeys that appears early on in my book. The Eildons are one of the classic landscapes of the borders, and it's this region that really forms the core of the text of The Ghost of the Forest. The Eildon Hills are a triple mountain, and they sit just above the town of Melrose. You can see them from anywhere within the Scottish borders region, and they also contain the largest hill fort complex in Scotland. So effectively what was at one time a city of the ancient Celts, likely a holy city, a place of assembly, a gathering point for one or many, even more tribes to get together. And it also occupies a very important part in the later border ballad traditions. And in my belief, there's a very strong connection that runs between that ancient land use, the ancient habitation there, and the tales and songs that came after. I've also explored a fair range of other landscapes in the course of my life. Just to share a couple of them with you, this is the Highlands of Scotland, and this is an area where I learned really to hike to begin with. We grew up a little bit further north. I return to the Highlands fairly regularly. Through my blog, I try and share some of the spectacular images there, and in a future date, I'd love to be able to do something more on that part of the country. I also have visited Wales. I know that you have an affection for ponies, so I chose to represent those particular journeys with this particular one. This is the Stone Circle at Penmine Mower up on the northern coast, and I've been lucky enough to travel around the northern and the western sections of Wales, learning a bit about that culture and learning a bit about the triads and the connections, the really ancient connections that there are between the lands that are now my home, the Old North, and the origins of the Welsh nation. And it's that material that helps to form a large component of the connecting tissue between the really ancient archaeological Celtic history and the more recent Scottish legends. By putting Welsh components in there, those were really the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that made everything take shape. And lastly, from a personal perspective, my other connection to Celtic myth and legends comes from the newer side of my family, from my wife, through her to my in-laws. We have family in Brittany, which is the furthest south of the Celtic countries. My wife grew up there, and my daughter is half Scottish and half Breton. A Briton born in the Old North, no less. And so we spend a fair bit of our time now heading across there, and I've been learning about that whole other culture. It's very closely connected to the Welsh, but refracted through a very different lens. It's evolved in a lot of different ways in a very, very different physical environment. So I'm in the process, really, of just beginning to dip my toes into a whole new, very, very rich vein of heritage and get my head around that. The image you can see here is one of the ancient primal forests in the middle of Brittany. Alas, they are substantially cut back, but where pockets remain, they are very, very impressive. And this section is called the Chaos of Corong. It's a distinctly Breton physical environment where geological processes far too complex to go into in great detail produced huge rivers of giant boulders stacked up into extraordinary landforms through which waters run, rivers, and they form some exceptional physical environments. If you happen to be in that part of the world, I do recommend exploring them. And that effectively introduces myself. This little map will neatly round off the story of the journeys I undertake. This is an illustration of the terrain over which the book The Ghost of the Forest takes place. Each area highlighted in red shows one of the regions covered by one of the expeditions conducted within the book. So it includes Edinburgh, the history of Walter Scott that we dealt with earlier, the Eildons, of which you've seen a photograph just now, the Upper Tweeddale region, which is very, very deeply connected to the origins of the legends of Merlin, probably the most famous of the names that features in the legends in the book. And then a series of journeys running pretty much along the line of the border in the region between Hadrian's Wall and the more agricultural, fertile Tweed Basin. This particular area of hill country proved to be very, very fertile hunting grounds, partly because the long-standing political conflicts between England and Scotland meant that it was quite a lawless region, one that wasn't ever properly, fully civilized. And secondly, because it's also one that hasn't, for various reasons, been that effectively explored. It remains today exceedingly remote. There are only 2 places in the whole of the Cheviot chain where roads actually cut through from one side to the other, and only one of them could even remotely be described as a highway. The land itself is empty. Forests, moors, Ministry of Defence territory, and there are all sorts of remains waiting within there, both in terms of folklore and legend, but also actually physical remains. There are quite a few unexplored piles of stones, unexplored structures, unexplored carvings, things that haven't been recorded, some of which I've been lucky enough to discover myself, but plenty of which have come to light within the space of the last 20 to 30 years that show that there is yet more that remains to be discovered. And I've tried with The Ghost of the Forest to encourage others to get involved in doing the same thing. I do believe that with a little bit of activity, with a bit of archaeological research in the right places, and with enough willing pairs of feet and hands, that there is honestly a huge amount of other material relating to what is effectively a Celtic lost civilization that remains to be recovered not that far from here. Part of what made this particular region such a useful area to be exploring is the presence of this little feature that's highlighted here in the broken line, and this is Hadrian's Wall. Now, a great many people have heard of this before. For those who haven't, this is the fortification that for many centuries marked the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire. And as such, it was one of the few places in northern Britain where there were lots and lots of stonemasons. The big advantage of that is it means that things got carved in stone, and stone remains last. Celtic Britons had tended to make most of their construction in wood. Presumably, things like carvings, idols, again, were similar. Wood-metal combinations that haven't survived, haven't lasted. Around Hadrian's Wall, by contrast, the Roman stonemasons left quite a substantial body of inscriptional and sculptural evidence relating to not just their own Roman culture, but also to the Celtic culture of the area. A great many of the soldiers that we consider Roman who garrisoned the wall were, of course, themselves Romano-British, so they came from other parts of Britain, and they brought their own traditions with them. They also would honour the spirits of the locality, the genius Loki being the spirit of the immediate locality, but also the gods who presided over the wider landscape. And so along the line of the wall, you have a wonderful body of evidence for the form and the pantheon of the North British Celtic religion. And there's not that much evidence for that elsewhere. So we get this little thin strip of land, which we have this wonderful body of archaeological data, next to another body of land where we have this wonderful quantity of later folklore recorded by Scott and the antiquarians. And by placing the two of them together, that was part of the exercise of assembling the lost mythology of the North, the legends that we can retrieve using that ancient data set, put together with the later one. One of the names that features in there is one which has come up quite a bit in your work, Chris, and that's Maponos, Mabon. Now, I know Mabon pretty well in the context of northern Britain, but he's a figure who has a heritage in Gaul and in the wider Celtic world, which I don't know that much about. And I've started to see some hints that there's a presence of Mabon in Brittany as well. So do you mind me if I start asking you some questions as regards that? I'd be quite curious to pick your brains a little. Would that be okay?
Yeah. So I don't know what your questions are, but go for it.
Within the northern British context, Mabon seems to me to fit in fairly clearly. So there's evidence for him localised pretty strongly around the western section of Hadrian's Wall. There are place names at Loch Mabon, at the Clach Mabon Stain, that connect to him. There's Mabon Law up near Hawick, and this geographical location seems to fall fairly closely to the territory of the people called the Selgavie. The Selgavie is a tribal name that's drawn from the Celtic word for hunter. So you've got this god, who is himself depicted as a hunter, located fairly clearly in that territory, and a people occupying that territory who seem to connect themselves to hunters. So there seems to be a role as a tribal deity. What I would like to ask you is, what are your thoughts about the origin of that? Do you see a Gaulish deity migrating northwards, or is it a case that the Gaulish evidence ends up further south because the northern civilization was so influential at some time? What do you think? How does the name Mabon, which is so strong in this particular region of Scotland, come to be so present in Gaul as well?
Well, I think it's very easy to make that mistake. You know, the old Celtic model that people used to learn in school, that everything went from east to west, the big migration theory and all of that, which, I mean, there's got to be some truth in that, but I think what people don't see is that there was a continuity of culture in Britain and Gaul, say, probably a few hundred years at least before the Romans turn up. So there's actually relatively little evidence for Maponos in Gaul. There's just as much along Hadrian's Wall and around the Solway Firth. So I'm thinking that he must have been not just a tribal deity, that he must have been quite important, you know, like Lugos or something. He must have been, I don't know if I would want to say pan-Celtic. I'm not particularly keen on that word, but I think he was sufficiently important to be known or to have very similar reflexes over a wide area. So I think my theory, which of course I can't prove, but my sense of it is that when the Romans arrive in, you know, around the Solway Firth area and they're building the wall, they come upon a cult of Maponos, which of course we know there was a cult of Maponos in France as well. So it's quite likely there was a very strong local cultus area, but I don't think I would see him as being just a god of one or two local tribes there. I think he's more widespread, and he gets some name changes probably in other places.
That seems quite realistic to me. I think that it seemed, based upon the connections between Maponos and the later kings in the region, in Welsh myths, the dynasty of the Cynbarching of Reged ends up ruling in roughly the same area, and they're, in the Welsh legends, very closely connected to Maponos. It seems to me likely that there is a connection between that regional state and that regional cultus, but then of course that could simply be because that particular culture ended up particularly devoted to a god who was more widely worshipped. And the fact that those stories relating to Arians, the Cynbarching, did form such a big part of the later Welsh tradition, I think that's maybe partly because Maponos was more widely important, because he played a far bigger role in that wider mythology. But that's the part that I don't know, and that's the part that I'm curious to.
Well, it's the part that's just really difficult to unravel. Everything about them becomes kind of mythologized. And I don't know, short of, some amazing manuscript manifesting itself that we don't have so far, I think that's just where we are, and that we're just going to have to live with that question mark forever.
There are plenty of inscriptions yet to be recovered in Gaul, so it's possible that a more detailed data set will build up in the fullness of time. Have you, perchance, come across anything regarding Mabon from Britain?
From Brittany, you're going to be largely disappointed, but we'll just have a look. It's much easier with a map. So the only place of real importance for Maponos in Gaul is at Chamalier, where there's a huge healing complex connected to a hot spring that was excavated in the 1970s.
This featured in your rather wonderful video about it, with the gentleman who did the excellent reconstruction work. That was really...
Oh.
I do heartily recommend anybody who's not seen that to watch that video. It was really a delight to see how that site ended up in the modern day.
Yeah, Patrice Courtois. I would love to meet that man. So there was a spring at Chamalier. There was apparently some kind of big nematon. There was a massive healing cult there. When they excavated it, they came out with thousands of wooden ex votos. So it was a really big deal, but it doesn't seem to have been particularly Romanized. It seems to have been very much a Celtic thing, even though the Romans were there. I don't know if it was secret, or it seems like it would have to have been an awfully well-kept secret, considering its popularity in its heyday. But there's no stone altars, there's no stone inscriptions, anything like that. The only reason we know it's connected to Maponos is because there was a lead tablet found, which was assumed to be a curse tablet for a while because it looks like one. But the more the translators become a little more confident with it, the more it looks like it's not a cursed tablet, but it is connected to some kind of a magical working. So that tablet is addressed to Maponos. So that's how we know, or how we infer, that Chamalier was probably a place primarily of Maponos, although it's quite possible other deities were addressed there as well. However, over at Savigny on the Swiss border, there's an abbey, and there's a record of a Maponos spring. I don't know if the spring's ever been found, but that gives us an indication that it's likely that the spring at Chamalier was deeply connected to Maponos. The only other references to Maponos are up here. There's a grave marker to an individual called Maponos, so nothing to do with the god. And down here at Saint-Remy, where there's massive Romano-Celtic temple remains and stuff, there's a potter's mark on a piece of pottery that the pot was made by a guy called Maponos. So we can assume that these people were named after the deity. So all this stuff's a really long way from Brittany. Sorry, go ahead.
A very long way from the Solway as well. It would be hard to imagine corners of France that are actually further removed. So presumably there must be something intermediate that just hasn't been discovered. There's very little evidence of population interchange between the Alps and Cumbria. Yes,
but we must remember that according to Caesar and I think a couple of the other Roman writers, the Druids went to Britain to train. The Druids probably had the same kind of freedom of movement among the various tribes that the Bards and Fili and so on had later in Wales and Ireland. So that would indicate to me that there is quite a lot of religious interchange. We'd need to be careful with thinking, deities are all tribal. Some of them certainly were. Some of them were certainly localized to landscape features like mountains or rivers and things. But some of them obviously traveled. And that seems to be especially true with the gods as opposed to the goddesses, who tend to be generally more localized with a couple of exceptions. There does, however, seem to be a connection between Maponos and Brittany. It's a little tenuous, but it might give you something to work on, because I know you're interested in that kind of thing. Maponos in Britain is conflated with Apollo in most of the inscriptions to him, not all of them. And of course, Apollo's associated with hunting, and this is also an attribute of Mabon ap Modron, essentially a literary character who appears to represent a memory of a deity. So in the Welsh story of Culhwch and Olwen, Mabon ap Modron is called upon to assist Arthur in the hunt of a giant boar. And the whole tale sort of hinges on Mabon's ability to handle certain hunting dogs, which are so ferocious that no one else can work with them. So 2 of these dogs have to be collected from Brittany.
Oh.
Interestingly, when Mabon and Arthur travel to Brittany to get the dogs, Mabon ap Modron is not referred to as Mabon ap Modron. He's referred to as Mabon ap Mellt, or Mabon, son of lightning. There was a tribe in Gaul known as the Meldi, who appear to have had a tutelary deity called Meldius, and there's an inscription to him at San Remy. I don't think that location's too significant. There's inscriptions to everybody at San Remy. It's just a place with a lot of temples.
Okay.
This Meldius, probably a god associated with lightning. Now, the movements of the Meldi aren't well understood, as well as apparently having been in Flanders and down here through Central Eastern France. This tribe name occurs over in Bulgaria. So maybe they were a kind of ancient travelers. Maybe they were a more migrating tribe. Or, we find that with some of the clans in Ireland as well. Maybe they just aren't quite as strong and they get pushed around to different areas. It's difficult to know what's going on with the Meldi. So I can't say that they didn't have connections to Brittany, but I certainly can't say that they did. I don't think it's known. But it's interesting that as soon as Mabon goes to the continent, the Welsh bards refer to him as Mabon ap Mellt.
Okay.
So that's a bit of a long shot, but it might give you something to follow up on.
My wife's village is just round the corner, a couple of miles away from a very old Romano-Gaulish site called Castanet, where there was a city at one point called Sulin constructed. It fell away to ruin, but the site itself remains important in the era when the Bretons came across and colonised Brittany. And it was one of the early chapel sites associated with St. Gildas, San Gildas, and became the seat of the dominant feudal lords to control central Brittany, the House of Rohan. The site itself is surrounded by a series of holy wells, and down to a very late date, into the 1600s, believe it or not, there stood there a very large statue of a pagan goddess called the Gruach Huarn. She was eventually pulled down and thrown in the river by the order of the Bishop of Ban on account of being an obvious pagan goddess that people were worshipping, but was then reset upon her feet in the gardens of the Chateau de Kinipoli, which is probably the most striking example that I've come across anywhere of the continuity of pre-Christian Celtic religion. That location has just uphill from it, along the road, the line of the old Roman road running from Sulin towards the regional capital of Carhaix, has a little dolmen and a farm beside it called Caer Mabon, which means Fortress of Mabon. It's just round the corner. So the presence of the name suggests something to me. And the fact that that landscape, which is so completely infused with older associations, should contain that name, to me does not seem like coincidence. I just could not tell you whether it is an example of a Roman era cult of Mabon, something really, really ancient, or if it actually indicates something imported from Britain at a later period when the Breton language was brought in. I think there's something, but I just do not know what it is. So if yourself or any of your listeners should happen to be able to shed any light on that, or to point in any particular directions to help with that, I would dearly love to hear from you.
That's fascinating. And, a lot of the Mabon story in Kilhuch and Alwyn, of course, takes place quite near Cornwall. It's quite possible that the legend would have been known to the Cornish who settled Brittany, and that Mabon would have been important. I have this theory, I won't go on too long about it because I want to talk about your stuff, but I have this theory that the deity Cunomaglos, who's quite well known around the Cotswold Severn area, south of the Severn, is somehow related to Mabon ap Modron, perhaps another reflex, who got renamed differently somehow. If it looks like Mabon and it walks like Mabon, it might be Mabon. And perhaps, you see what you want to see. So that's what I see, is that there's a connection there. So it's quite possible that there was once more to do with Mabon in Cornwall than there is now. And certainly, we find a lot of stuff about Madrin or Modron, his mother, there, which points to that too.
Okay. Interesting.
So one thing that struck me about your book was quite a bit of emphasis on Cocydius, or folklore that might point to a memory of him, like the brown man of the moor and the mysterious figure in the chapel in Fergus of Galloway, and so on.